I'm ITV's Judge Rinder. I've been a criminal barrister for over a decade. I'm going to be examining cases that have shocked the nation.
Coming up, the story of Mick Philpott.
He loved his kids. He lived every moment for them.
We hear from Mick Philpott's son in his first ever television interview.
He's always saying he's innocent. He asked me if I believe him, and I'm like, of course I do.
Then, later in the programme, a tragic family story.
I realised at that juncture how much my mother relied on my father.
A story of death, suicide, and murder.
I'll never forgive him. He's dead to me. That's how I deal with it.
This is Judge Rinder's crime stories.
Despite having dealt with serious cases for both the prosecution and the defense for over a decade, I too can be affected by people's cruelty. The case of Mick and Mairead Philpott is an example of such a crime. This couple set their house on fire on purpose, killing 6 children inside and wiping out every one of Mairead's young family.
Nearly all of us have a morbid fascination with crime and the psyche behind the act. Maybe because it brings us face to face with our own mortality, something that has always made us curious, or perhaps fearful. But every now and then there's a crime that reminds us that not all horror stories are fictitious, but stories of fact. Many of you will be familiar with the Mick Philpott story, but now we'll be looking at this horrific crime from someone else's perspective. Michael Philpott, Mick Philpott's son, who was only 14 at the time of the fire. Michael was one of the 2 children Mick Philpott had with Heather Kehoe. When the relationship ended, Heather would take custody of the 2 toddlers, including Michael.
Dad always did stuff with us all the time. Took us fishing, got me playing snooker, taught me to play snooker. Very good at that now. Just the kind of the stuff you'd see in movies, that where the father bonds with the son, he'd do all those kinds of things with me. But it was like a friendship, like best friends. We did everything together. Christmas and all that was always the best as well. Loads of Christmas presents, big Christmas dinners. If it snowed, we'd go outside, make snowballs and everything. Dad wasn't afraid to join in. I could say it was the biggest influence on my life. If it weren't for my dad, I don't think I'd be the same person I am now. It helped me through some of the toughest times. It was like my guardian angel.
Whilst Michael was living primarily with his mother, Philpott had been busy building a new, ever-increasing family. In 2000, Mick met Mairead Duffy, a 19-year-old single mother of 1. He went on to start a simultaneous relationship with a 16-year-old single mother. She'll be known throughout this case as Philpott's mistress. In 2003, Mick and Mairead got married. Surprisingly, his mistress, who was pregnant at the time, was a bridesmaid. It was at the wedding Jim Duffy met his daughter's new husband.
I think it was the wedding. It was the first time I was actually introduced to me. Then we came back to a reception. She was sitting with me and the rest of the family for a bit. He was going around all the women, this, that, and the other. Then he came over, grabbed a hold of her, and everywhere he went, he was like dragging her along behind him. He was the boss man.
At his earliest opportunity, Michael moved to live with his father. In January 2011, he packed his bags and moved to Derby. By this time, Mick Philpott now had 11 children living with him.
Dad had his wife and his mistress. I didn't exactly think it was right at first, but it's something that grew on me. There was, I don't know how to explain it, was happy, it wasn't hurting anyone. It worked. It was just one big family. Even if it was out of the ordinary, it worked really well. And I suppose with that many kids in the house, I suppose an extra mum helped.
I thought, well, everything seems okay here. Let them get on with it. Kids were happy. They'd go and cook a meal and they'd all go into the kitchen and sit round the big table, eat a meal, they'd all come back in again.
Including myself, there was 12 kids. It was always busy, always fun, always loud. Things to do. There was never a dull moment. I think coming back home to the kids was probably the best bit to look forward to. We just stuck together. There was no splitting us up.
Mick Philpott's family seemed to be ever expanding. This would be picked up by the press. Back in 2006, Philpott had hit the headlines when he was criticised for wanting a larger council house for his growing family.
Father of 15, living with his pregnant wife and girlfriend.
He even appeared on the Jeremy Kyle show and others to defend his lifestyle with his wife and mistress.
He's got a temper, but the only thing I ever really saw of him when he released his rage was when it concerned his family.
The offensive. I say you are very defensive.
I said you do,
Why
mate.
are you so
I will
defensive?
be. Because when it comes to my kids, I'm very, very
I've just
defensive.
complimented your kids.
After I had a go at you.
It was the first time the public got a glimpse of Philpott's violent nature.
He sits on national television and does that. No wonder you can't get a damn job because...
It was also during this period when his dark past came to light.
I'll tell you what it's about. The fact is, I've got a criminal record from 1978.
His criminal record would shock the public. Philpott was convicted of attempted murder and wounding with intent against his partner and her mother in 1978. He was sentenced to 7 years in prison. 3 years and 2 months later, he was released. There was no denying Mick Philpott's violent past. But the events that followed would eclipse all others. Coming up.
Upstairs in the Derby home, Cover 9 call was made from Mick Philpott's phone.
It happened in Derby in the early hours of this morning.
Another journalist who got there just before me came up to me and said, "Do you know who it is, Phil?" I said, "No." He said, "It's Mick Philpott's kids."
Earlier we heard about Mick Philpott and his son's account of his time living with him. We learned of Philpott's journey into the spotlight, from his early relationships to current relationships with his mistress and wife Mairead. It was also during this period that the public would hear of his criminal past. Although horrific, what was to come would shock the nation.
Basically said that she was going swimming and that she took the kids, which was fine, but normally if she was going to go swimming, she'd take all of them, and she only took her kids, which we thought was quite weird.
On the 28th of July 2011, Philpott's mistress left the house with her children. She had gone for good.
No one really expected it. We didn't see any change in her. It was quite a shock. Everything was all hunky-dory and happy, and then they disappear and it just all collapsed.
Michael started to notice a significant change in his father's demeanour.
He wasn't his normal self. He was very down. He wasn't sleeping, he wasn't eating. He'd just given up completely. He definitely wasn't himself. You could just see it in his eyes. He was forever crying and trying whatever way he could to try and get them back.
Over the coming months, Mick Philpott would attempt to get his children back, with little result. He would arrange a date in court and try to win custody of the children. But a day before they were due in court, tragedy would strike. May the 11th, 2012, the family's home was ablaze.
One of the neighbours, she was screaming. Obviously, with that, I just bolted straight over the road.
Went over there, the door was ablaze. You know, the side of the house, smoke was coming out the windows.
Flames ripped through 18 Victory Road uncontrollably. Inside, there were 6 sleeping children. Desperate to get the children out of the house, Jamie and Darren had run to the back of the property to the conservatory.
I remember getting into the conservatory and then getting into the kitchen, and you couldn't go further. You couldn't barely see. You could just, the noise, just the whirling noise. They all say fire has a voice. It's only when you see it, that it stays like that, that you can understand it. You think you ain't getting up them stairs because it's there. There was no way in.
Emergency services arrived at the scene. One by one, the children were agonizingly pulled from the house and resuscitation attempted.
You'll never understand the sight that we've seen.
Something that you don't forget.
Devastatingly, only Dwayne, aged 13, was pulled out alive. He was rushed to intensive care at Derby Hospital.
An image that I will never forget. The smell I will never forget. The sight of them poor little babies coming out, I will never, ever forget.
Jade, John, Jack, Jesse and Jaden had all died from smoke inhalation.
Upstairs in the Derby home, Cover 9 call was made from Mick Philpotts.
It happened in Derby in the early hours of this morning.
It wouldn't be long until this distressing event caught the eyes of the media.
We had a call, there'd been a house fire, and children had died in that. And obviously, that was a huge story. I think it was just after 9 o'clock in the morning. And another journalist who got there just before me came up to me and said, "Do you know who it is, Phil?" And I said, "No." He said, "It's Mick Philpott's kids."
Matt, we know that emergency services...
The news spread swiftly.
...road around 4:45 this morning, where they found a severe fire at the front of the property. Firefighters battled through the flames.
For Michael, this was the first time he'd heard of the fire at his family home.
I was at the house the day before the fire. So we was going on a fishing trip. And we wake up the next morning, nice bright and early, and we see it on the news, the house fire. And I didn't worry at first. I started phoning Marie, phoning my dad. Couldn't get anything.
It wasn't until Michael spoke to his brother that he realised the true devastation of the fire.
And he basically broke down on the phone to me, explaining what had happened. I just collapsed. I should have been there that night, but we left a day early. Maybe if, I don't know, I wasn't a great sleeper, if I was still there, I could have done something. It's one of the things that haunt me the most, knowing that I could have made a difference. That I promised him I'd always be there when they needed me most, and the fact that I left to go with friends fishing and I wasn't there when they needed me. Even Dad tried everything to get in.
Flowers and tributes were placed at the house. Duane, now in intensive care, was surrounded by his grief-stricken family. But when visiting them in hospital, Jimmy Duffy noticed something peculiar about Mick and Mairead's behaviour.
We got there, nobody was explaining what had happened. I walked in and there was like a little room. Mairead and Mick were in there and there was a priest and she was crying, but he was just sat there with his head like this here. And he turned round in the room and he says to her, "Oh, you've still got one of your kids, I've got none." Mick and Mairead were up in the room with him. "Why don't you just go and have a break and they'll sit here and talk to him." And this was at 2 o'clock in the afternoon and I think it was about 11 o'clock at night when they came back. And she had all lickies up her neck and that there.
Mairead returned to the hospital with a love bite on her neck. Jimmy was convinced that something wasn't right.
The way he was behaving and that there, I thought to myself, you know, he seems to be putting a big act on.
Mick Philpott's odd behaviour would continue over the course of the next few days. 3 days after the fire, Duane lost his battle for life. All 6 children caught in the blaze had now passed away. Police were determined to find the cause of the fire.
As part of any investigation, you have to look around, look for clues as to how the fire started, what started it, and it became clear very quickly that this wasn't some electrical fault. This wasn't some kind of freak spark. This fire had actually been started deliberately.
Police had discovered the blaze was no accident. The fire had been intentionally set. Arson specialists and police examined the decimated home. What they found was shocking. Petrol had been poured through the letterbox and set alight. The fire spread up the staircase positioned directly in front of the door. This was now a murder investigation.
Police have confirmed a woman in her late 20s has been arrested on suspicion of murder. Our correspondent Phil Brewster is there now. Phil, what's the latest?
Initially, Philpott's ex-mistress and her brother-in-law were arrested. Within 4 days, however, the police were confident that the 2 accused weren't involved in the arson attack. They were then released without charge. 2 days after Duane's passing, Mick and Mairead would surprise everyone and call a press conference.
I've actually been down to our home, and what we saw, we just cannot believe it.
There was something odd about the way Mick and Mairead were conducting themselves. This had caught the attention of the police. We've asked Darren Stanton, a retired police officer and body language expert, to assess the Philpotts' demeanour at the press conference.
We actually show genuine emotion just in fleeting moments. With Mairead, as she's brought into the press conference, she's showing extreme sort of distress, but it's not consistent with the distress that a real person shows. There'd be different expressions coming in. When they're trying to fabricate the emotions, they imagine what that person would be feeling and they do their very best to act out those emotions. In doing that, they're generally way over the top. She has her head down, her face is partially covered with her hair for most of the press conference. This is very much the Mick Philpott show. You know, he's in control, all again about the assertion of power and control over Mairead. And I think, you know, throughout the whole process we can see that that's very much the agenda that Mick's pushing.
Mick and Mairead were now the prime suspects, but the authorities had been one step ahead of them the entire time. Police had bugged the hotel room they were staying in.
We sticking to the story? Good. Do you know something? They've got nothing on me. Nothing. A few discrepancies, that's all it is.
Police now believe that they had the arsonists. 48 hours later, Mick and Mairead Philpott were arrested. Also during the period, the police arrested a third man, Paul Mosley, a close friend of Mick's. Although the police were convinced Mosley was connected to the crime, he was released on bail in order to gather more evidence to secure his conviction. Whilst Mick and Mairead were in custody, a funeral had been planned for all 6 of the children.
Attending the funeral, I think, of those 6 children was one of the most heartbreaking things I think you will ever see. The sight of those 6 horse-drawn carriages.
Big funeral and lots of people, lots of publicity, and
there were hundreds of people lining the streets.
I still remember as if it was yesterday. It was more of it saying a thank you than it was saying a goodbye. Like, thank you for being in our lives, for making our lives happy.
You then had this awful scene where you could see 6 white coffins, one after the other, being brought out of the carriages and carried on the shoulders of friends and family.
Seeing the coffins. Just so quiet, reminded me of that night.
After the funeral had happened, there was a lot of talk about this isn't right, he should be here, this, that, and the other, he's wrongly accused, and every father should deserve the right to say goodbye to his kids. The last words we spoke was, we will get our justice.
But that would be for a jury to decide. On the 12th of February 2013, the trial began. Mick, Mairead and Paul Mosley all denied 6 separate counts of manslaughter in relation to the children's deaths.
They came in. Mairead, as she usually is, was just very quiet.
Just looked at each other and, you know, thinking, oh, it's one big joke. We haven't got charged with murder. We've got it down to manslaughter.
He thought it was all a big game, man. You know, he thought he was going to get away with it, I suspect. He still played it as a joke and a game. He thought it was all a game.
I think Mick came to that trial with the full intention, the full view that he would be found innocent.
But the evidence that had been gathered by the prosecution was damning. This was the first time that the jury and the press inside the court had heard the full extent of what had happened.
The most obvious bit of evidence against Mick, Mairead and Paul Mosley was the petrol traces found on their clothing. Petrol samples have certain additives in them, almost like a DNA print, as it were. They found petrol had been poured through the letterbox, so they took samples of that. Several days later, a petrol can and I think a rag soaked in petrol was found nearby. Officers also seized clothing belonging to Mick, Mairead and Paul Mosley as well. And when they analysed those, they found petrol traces on it, which showed that it was the same petrol that had been used to start the house fire itself. And that's how police were able to link the 2 together. So that was pretty significant.
As well as the forensic evidence, the prosecution turned to the audio recordings that the police had made.
The first was in the hotel, and the second time was when they actually bugged the police van.
We'll walk free and prove our innocence, right? You're definitely sticking with the story.
There was no denying how damning this evidence was. But why would Mick, Mairead and Paul Mosley set the fire in the first place?
The prosecution wanted to sow this seed in the minds of the jury that Mick Philpott had a plan, setting the fire, and the idea was that he would then wake up, charge upstairs,
rescue all 6 children. He would then be portrayed as a victim, because somebody had done this terrible thing to him and his family in his home. But he'd also be portrayed as the hero, the person who put his own life at risk to save his 6 children. And if in the process the house burnt down, great, because he'd get a bigger council house too.
The jury had listened to the cases of both the prosecution and the defense. It was now time for them to make a decision. The couple had lost 6 children, but the evidence had put them at the heart of the incident. Would the jury show sympathy? When the jury returned from deliberation, they found all 3 defendants guilty of manslaughter.
When the verdicts came back, the judge delayed sentencing until the following day because she wanted to have time to think about all the elements of the story. And when she came back, the judge was unbelievably damning about Mick Philpott.
Paul Mosley and Mairead were both sentenced to 17 years in prison. Philpott was given a life sentence and would have to serve at least 15 years behind bars.
I think she described him as a disturbingly dangerous individual who had no moral compass. She said that everything, right from the fire, had been a performance for the public, police, and now in front of this court. Everything has been an act designed to elicit sympathy where none was deserved.
Philpott expressed his anger at the severity of his conviction and swore at the judge as he left court. The jury had found Mick, Mairead, and Paul Mosley guilty. Michael Philpott remains convinced of his father's innocence.
He's always saying he's innocent. He asked me if I believe him, and I'm like, of course I do. He'll say something like, I've always put you kids first and everything else. Like, I know you have, Dad. He says you wouldn't do anything to harm us. He loved his kids. He lived every moment for them.
Coming up, a tragic story. A story of a murder so cruel, it threatens to tear a family apart forever.
I'll never forgive him. He's dead to me. That's how I deal with it.
What you're about to hear is a crime so cruel and extraordinary that it would devastate a family forever.
Amongst the ancient valleys and mountains of South Wales lies the small town of Pencoed. It was this small town where Ray and Rita decided to marry and build a family. Ray ran a local upholstery business. And in 1972, Rita became a stay-at-home mother. Martin, one half of twin brothers, remembers early family life fondly.
Up until I was 10, it was just myself and Mark as kids, with my mother, my father. Then Kirsty and Carl, another set of twins, were born.
My brothers were 10 years older than us. Martin is a totally different character to Mark. They look alike, but polar opposites to each other.
Mark was the sportier person. I was more into astronomy, films, and philosophy. I was a philosophical kind of child.
At the age of 19, Martin moved from the family home.
Although I was pretty close to Carl and Kirsty, I left home when I was 19. I started a family at a very young age.
Over time, Martin's siblings would follow suit and leave to live their own lives. However, in 2011, a tragedy in the family would bring them back together. Ray, father of 4, had passed away in January, aged just 63.
It sped down on the family quite hard. My mother, I realized at that juncture how much my mother relied on my father, and she struggled after his passing.
Losing her husband devastated Rita, and the family pulled together to help out with the business Ray had left behind. It was left to Mark to take control of the business, but this would eventually prove too much for him.
During this time, Mark was having certain difficulties in his personal life. He went through a divorce, and he couldn't cope very well with the divorce. And he began to drink heavily.
His drinking spiraled out of control. He was always a heavy drinker, but it totally accelerated it.
Mark's dependence on alcohol was growing. This took its toll on the business and his relationship with his mother. His drinking continued over the years and the bills racked up, but the profits tumbled. Mark and his mum would have arguments about the running of the company, which put a strain on their relationship. In 2015, the family were hit by yet another tragedy that would put everything into perspective.
January the 2nd, last year, I had a text saying that Carl has taken an overdose and the paramedics are working on him as we speak. And she phoned me back 5 minutes later and told me that Carl was gone.
After battling depression since the age of 16 and numerous suicide attempts, Carl's twin sister had always suspected the day would come.
I guess I was always expecting a phone call somewhere down the line that he'd succeeded, because he'd tried it so many times before.
My mother, she was totally distraught. Carl was the apple of her eye. She, that was her baby.
After losing her husband and now her youngest son, Rita's health began to decline.
Looking at my mother, it breaks my heart to see my mother in such a way also.
After Carl died, she was so broken. And she just crumbled. She'd always been so strong for a tiny woman in stature. So strong. But it totally broke her. So that's when I had to have more to do with him.
Mark had sold his house to his ex-wife and was left homeless. He had moved into the company's premises. Despite a collapsing relationship with her son and mourning Carl's death, Rita stepped in to help.
And my mother walked into the building and saw that he was sleeping rough. So I believe it was at my mother's bequest that he moved into the house. I thought this was the beginning of the recovery of my brother from his alcohol, but I suppose when the alcohol gets a hold of you, it's very difficult to not let it seduce you, I suppose. And he was seduced by it.
I would get angry phone calls from him regarding my mother because of his drinking, even though I didn't want to have more to do with him. I had to have more to do with him because I was supporting my mother.
Mark's behaviour became more disturbing the more he drank. This would be something Martin would pick up on when meeting his brother at the local pub.
I think I had a pint, and he'd have 2 or 3 double vodkas to every round, and he seemed in a jovial spirit, but the way he talked of my mother, he spoke of her as if she were the epitome of evil. He told me that he felt as if he could kill Mum. I didn't ask him why he said such words. If you speak to a drunk man, it's pointless. You can't form a conversation with them.
Knowing of Mark and Rita's broken relationship, Martin left the pub and took no notice of his brother's slurred words. A few days had passed, and Paul and Kirsty would attempt their regular phone call to check up on their elderly mother.
It probably got to around lunchtime before I asked Kirsty when we heard off Mum. I'll drop her a text, I'll give her a ring now.
Despite every effort, Kirsty was unable to contact her mother.
Something wasn't right. She would pick up the phone, or as soon as she'd noticed that she had a missed call from me, she would ring me back because she knew how much I worried about her. I phoned Mark's mobile, which he didn't answer. He phoned me back. I said, yeah, I've been trying to get hold of Mum. Where is she? And he just said to me that she's in the toilet. She's not feeling too well. She's being sick. She's got a stomach bug, and I'll get her to give you a call when she comes out. I said to Paul, I said, something's happened. You're going to have to go down there. You're going to have to go and check on Mum.
With his father's business in decline, it was quite clear that Mark was under an immense amount of pressure. But instead of asking his family for help, he hid his problems and he turned to alcohol. Despite his addiction getting increasingly worse, nobody in their wildest imagination could have predicted what was to follow.
Coming up.
Mark was in front of me, holding a carpet knife. He stood there and looked through me. He said, Paul, do you want to die today?
Earlier, we heard the story of the Stevens family. After losing a husband and son, Rita's health had begun to decline. Her son Mark took over the family business, but had become heavily reliant on alcohol, which was destroying both his father's legacy and his relationship with his mother. A tragic story. But after daughter Kirsty had failed to reach her ill mother, what came next would shake this family to their core.
The house is at the bottom of a cul-de-sac. You're facing it as soon as you turn into the street, really. It was around the corner. I approached the house as I normally would. If she was in, the porch to the house would be open. Tried the door as usual and it was locked.
Paul knew that something wasn't right.
Looked through the window, and because the sun was strong behind me, so I shielded myself so I could see into the room. And I could see a covered shape started knocking on the window. Going back to the porch door, I was knocking on that. And I had no idea whether Mark was even in the house. Mark was in front of me, holding a carpet knife. He stood there, looked through me. He said, "Paul, do you want to die today?"
It was now a matter of life or death as Paul tried desperately to disarm his brother-in-law. Somehow, through the struggle, Paul had managed to gain the upper hand on Mark.
I pinned Mark's left arm down with my left knee, and I made a 999 call. Then he just seemed to deflate. His muscles relaxed. Yeah, I didn't feel at that point then he was a danger to me.
Paul made his way into the room where he suspected his mother-in-law was. The 999 operator asked him what he was expecting to see.
I said, well, I fully expect that my mother-in-law has died and that she's under this blanket. The operator asked if I would be prepared to pull that blanket back and confirm my worst fears. She was so blooded, it was difficult to tell where the individual stab wounds were.
Rita Stevens, aged just 67, had been murdered by her own son. Unaware of the tragedy that had transpired, Kirsty was waiting anxiously for news of her mother. She attempted to call her husband, but it was her brother that picked up the phone.
I said to Mark, I said, "Has Paul got down there?" And he said, "Yeah." Can I speak to him? And he said, "No." I said, "Why?" He said, "He's outside doing his bit, phoning the police." What the hell has happened? Where's Mum? I want to speak to Mum. And he said, "You can't. She's dead. I've killed her."
Mark was led away from the house by police officers. Confronted by a harrowing crime scene, forensics and police would start their investigation into the murder. It would not be until Rita's body had been taken away that the true devastation of the crime became apparent. She had been mercilessly stabbed 37 times around her head and face.
I phoned Kirsty and she just broke down on the phone and told me that Mark had murdered Mum. I realised that he had told me that he was going to do it, and I didn't do anything about it. Knowing that what my brother was, that he was at one point an articulate, intelligent man, I didn't believe that he was capable of such atrocities. When I identified my mother's body, I didn't realize how she was murdered. And I stroked my mother's head and kissed her on the forehead and just told her that I was so sorry, because I felt that I could have stopped it.
In October 2015, 4 months after he murdered his mother, Mark would appear in court to enter his plea.
The first day I saw my brother was October the 12th, whereas others saw a killer. I saw an ill man, dazed, confused. He didn't appear to know what day it was. He just looked totally and utterly ill. pleaded guilty to manslaughter, but not guilty to murder.
His line of defence was loss of self-control. By that, he completely tried to assassinate my mother's character.
I don't know how much input Mark had into that. I don't know. I know he totally besotted my mother, and he did not have a good word to say about me. I don't hold that against him, but it was a bitter pill to swallow for me.
The initial trial was held the following February. However, the jury, after hearing arguments from both the prosecution and the defence, were unable to come to a decision. So Mark's case went to a retrial in April 2016.
In the second trial, it was, I don't think it took an hour to come up with a guilty verdict for murder, and he then received 20 years.
The jury had heard about the final horrific moments of Rita's life. Mark had taken a carving knife and fork and attacked his mother, inflicting 37 stab wounds to her head and face. He then covered her body in a blanket and went to sleep for the night. In a heartbreaking story, the Stevens family now only has 2 remaining members free to walk the streets. But both grief-stricken siblings have different ways of coping with their loss.
I lost 2 people that day. I lost my twin brother, and I lost my mother. I decided to forgive my brother, and as soon as I did, I felt a huge amount of relief. It didn't make things better, but I felt relief. And I've gestured to him my support, but at the moment he doesn't accept such a thing. And I believe I'm probably a reminder of a life past.
If that's the way that he wants to deal with it, by, you know, forgiving him for himself, then I accept and respect that. But no, that's not how I feel. I will never forgive him. He's dead to me. That's how I deal with it. He's dead.
It's almost impossible to fathom the effect that a crime like this has on an entire family. Despite this appalling offense, Martin and Kirsty are nevertheless closer now than they've ever been.